Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's call. During today's webinar, we are going to discuss how Reddit adopted and scaled workflow automation to enhance security and efficiency across their entire organization in a smart, secure way. I'm Hannah. I've been a customer success manager at Tynes for a little over 2.5 years, helping customers like Reddit build impactful automations. I'm super excited to introduce our guest, Cian Geoghegan, today onto our webinar.
Hey, how's it going? Glad to be here. Like Hannah said, I'm Cian. I'm based in Dublin. I'm staff CorpTech Engineer for Reddit. So I deal with all kinds of fun IT automation and also planning strategies for it. So I think we'll dive a bit into that today.
Awesome. Welcome. Before we get started, I wanted to go over the 3 areas where we're going to be focusing today. So we'll start with discussing why Reddit decided to move forward with workflow automation. We'll then get into how the existing automations are helping them enhance security and empower efficiency at scale. And then lastly, we'll get into the future of workflow orchestration and automation at Reddit, so some of the use cases that they're looking to implement in the near term. We're also going to save some time at the end for some questions. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat throughout the entire webinar. We'll check at the end and make sure we cover them during our Q&A section. So to start, wanted to just put this quote from you, Cian, out here. So this is a quote that we took during our prep for this webinar and wanted to just use that to set the stage. And then ask, what were the primary drivers for adopting workflow automation at Reddit?
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of summed it up a little here, but I'm sure anyone that's familiar with IT side of things or any systems, if you can automate it, it's generally the best way to go. User error can have a lot of downstream impacts. So the more we automate, the less risk we have of any errors coming in from that. Obviously, as we're growing, it's a huge deal for us to kind of free up time for the rest of our team, our cross-functional partners, by having as much things automated and hiding in the background doing their thing without them needing any input.
Nice. So it sounds like automation wasn't just about simplifying your existing processes, but it was really important for helping you scale as the team got larger.
100%, yeah. Obviously, we've just recently gone public, so we have a lot of commitments we need to abide by now, and getting to that point, automation was kind of one of the key aspects that we needed to bring in to streamline everything, but also provide a better experience for everyone in Reddit.
Awesome. And I'd like to get into some of the first use cases that you decided to build out in Tynes. I know we talked a little bit about 3 different tools that were a big focus. So kind of getting into these and telling us how you decided which automations you should tackle first.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a few here, Jamf, Omnitsa, and Jira. That's just a few callouts. We have 25 plus extra integrations that we're actively working with. And obviously, we're constantly testing and looking at what else we can bring in and automate and take some of the work from. Jamf and Omnitsa, for instance, is for our endpoint management side. Matthew Warren and Reddit, that I work with quite closely, is very much involved in that side of the house and has built some incredible automations for us for endpoint management, making sure everything stays up to date, making sure when a laptop is given out, instead of help desk having to go in and type in the user it's assigned to, we have it all in the background doing it automatically. And again, kind of removing the human component so that there's less chance of errors happening and everything is up to date. Jira ties into pretty much everything we do because it's our ticketing system, and we can then interlink between the likes of Jamf and Omnitsa flows so that we can update tickets to say, hey, this has been assigned to XYZ, but also in a lot of other automations we have, Jira is a big focus for us. Well, like I said, we have 25 plus other systems that we currently are integrating, and we have a lot more in our testing environments that we're looking at how we can integrate and what we can do and what that kind of unlocks for us.
Yeah, that's huge. Prior to automation, was all of this handled manually? Were you having to complete all of these tasks by hand or assign it to somebody?
There was a lot of manual lift, thankfully not on my end, but obviously on our end user support side and endpoint engineering side. We did have some basic automations from other tools, but we very quickly realized it wasn't going to scale to what we needed. And we needed to kind of streamline everything to make sure we can keep everything running in the background without people having to actively click buttons.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And it sounds like you kind of focused on those specific tools that you work in day out in order to build out those automations. Is there any advice that you have for, choosing which tools to work with first in times?
Yeah, our big ones are kind of around endpoint security, security in general, and also our identity systems, and also like our mail systems, that kind of thing. The big things that everyone in the company interacts with, they may not know they're interacting with, but behind the scenes, there's a lot of work goes into keeping them running and everything ticking.
Awesome. Well, I know we've talked a bit about the use cases that you started your automation journey with. After implementing these automations, have you seen any efficiency improvements, any like metrics or things that have improved over time?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff we've kind of built is not necessarily efficiency improvements. It's very much just perfect improvements for security and stuff, so that we can get alerting. We can have alerting fire the way we want without false positives. So like basically any manual process we had seen the help desk using, for instance, we'd talk to them and ask, how can we make your life easier? What would make your life easier? How can we take away some of the burden of what you have to do? So offboarding is kind of, I'm sure everyone on the call that has to deal with offboarding is very much aware that if it's a manual process, it's a lot of steps to ensure you're freeing up licenses, you're removing access, you're making sure everything's shut down. And while we did have SSO and SCIM, there's only so much you can do with both of them without some kind of automation in the background. So for the manual processes, we've definitely, it's probably saved 30 minutes plus on an offboarding for our end user services, which is a huge save in the grand scheme of things. Big red button is also one we built for the security side of things. So if there's an active incident and we need to kind of lock an account just so we can investigate, rather than having to have someone manually go in and suspend the user, clear sessions, that kind of thing, we built a page in Times, which I think we can kind of talk about a little bit more later in this, but build a page, you can just go to it, it's gated access on it, so only certain people can run it, but you put in an email address, it will look up the user, it will lock the account, and it will trigger some Slack messages, things like that, so we're aware what's going on and we can kind of start investigating. And then we've also kind of built more, the likes of Google Groups. Google Groups are great and they're used throughout our company, throughout most people's companies. The problem comes when you need to start having groups and things for managers, their chains, that kind of thing. There's not really easy ways of automating that. So we've essentially built a custom model within Reddit using Times and the Google APIs to automatically take new managers, create groups for them, populate it with either their direct reports, if it's a reporting group, their org chain, if it's an org chain group, which has helped a lot with the kind of business side of the house where HR may need to send an email to just specific people, or we want to invite specific people to meetings rather than people having to go in and look at their reports and manually add them. You add one group, does it all for you. And then in the background, it will update when someone changes manager. If a manager becomes an IC, it will automatically remove the groups and transfer everything across. And then kind of the last big part was like empowering people to build and deploy. Again, I'm sure a lot of people on this call are familiar with deploying Python or Go, or whatever code you're using in a big company is generally not as easy as just writing a script. There's a lot of aspects involved in getting it pushed into production and making changes and things. But that also has the other side where you need to be familiar with coding. You need to have some kind of coding background to actually be able to do them things. Times has kind of allowed us to bring in people that wouldn't have the same coding background as myself or some other people on the team to actually build and create things. And we've been able to create automations for things that we didn't necessarily think about, but people had in the back of their mind. They just didn't know how to put that into code. So it's been great at actually empowering the team to be able to build and experiment and create automations, like I said, that we never even thought of needing.
That's awesome. And it sounds like for the existing stories, you're getting benefit not only from the amount of like human hours it's taking to complete these tasks, but also the speed of response. Like thinking about the big red button, I'm sure like if something super like urgent was happening and you needed to react quickly, that's just a lifesaver, being able to press like one button and get everything turned off for that user.
Yeah, 100%. And it's kind of, again, we can probably talk about it a little more later on, but it's a great example of how you can use times to where the APIs don't necessarily have granular control. You can use times as a proxy almost to do things without needing to give access to the full APIs that the API key may give access to. The only thing they need to know is to put in an email, click a button, and it will do its magic behind the scene.
That's awesome. And are you doing that with like just basically gating that API behind a times page and restricting what API calls it can make?
Yeah, so the times page itself, that's what kickstarts a lot of our events. And then that page itself is restricted to certain groups of people that have permission to actually run the actions. But again, you know, it requires high-level API keys that would give a lot of access that people don't need. And this way we can allow people to quickly act without them needing to know the actual APIs they're hitting. They just, as far as they're concerned, it's just a Reddit web page they're hitting, and they're given back the response in a web page. They don't see any of the behind-the-scenes fun.
That's awesome. And I know we've kind of hinted at this through the past couple of questions, but I did want to just ask, why Tines? Why did Reddit decide that Tines is the right automation platform for them?
Yeah, for sure. So like, I think it's a lot of it was the accessibility of the automations in Tines. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, you don't need a coding background. Once you understand how an API works, even to that point, basic knowledge of I can query this and it will give me information, or I can send a payload here and it will do something. That's kind of the level you need to know versus actually knowing how to code it in Python and deal with the credentials and secret management, that kind of thing. It obfuscates all of that for people who are less from a coding background. So it was great for us to be able to have a tool like that and share it with people who can now build things that they may not have had the prior experience with. The other major reason we went with Tines was Tines is very much an integrator rather than an integration. So what I mean by that is if you're dealing with identity data, it's always in JSON and it can be nested arrays, that kind of thing. A lot of tools, I mean, most tools similar handle JSON, but Tines is the best I've seen. And I think most people on my team would agree, best we've seen in terms of handling the JSON. The fact you can literally look at an event, double click beside it, and you can copy the JSON path without needing to actually remember what the path is huge and such a time saver for us to be able to quickly build and respond to things as needed.
Awesome. So it sounds like your team's been able to do a lot more even without like the deep technical knowledge that would typically be required of somebody to build out an automation or build out a script.
Yeah, 100%. The JSON alone is a huge time saver, because if you're dealing with that in Python, you need to remember what path you're looking for. You need to remember what data you're getting in. Times you can essentially, if you haven't had to deal with that stuff in a coding sense, you can just, like I said, double click on the event path you want. It will copy the JSON path, put that into an event, and you're ready to go. You can see the data that you're dealing with and you can build off that. So it's definitely been key in helping us and helping the team be able to build quick and respond to integrations that need to be stood up to do things that we never even expected, but are now becoming critical paths for us.
Awesome. Love that. And I did want to take some time to talk about the future of automation at Reddit. You've already built out so many fantastic automations. You're getting value out of them. What are you looking to next as you, increase the automations and build out more for the team?
Yeah, for sure. So a huge thing, and again, most people on this call are probably very familiar with AI. Everyone wants to add AI to everything. Um, Especially, certain systems don't want to integrate with Slack, and it can become quite messy when you have 20 different chatbots talking to a user. So with Tides at the minute, we're trying to combine that all into one place, and have APIs come into Tides. Tides will then handle the response and send it through one single bot, essentially. So the user knows of one bot they interact with. That bot is where it will send information back and forth from. We're currently doing it with our help desk team, where they have a bot that will respond and help you, send you some, knowledge-based articles about something you've asked. If you need to raise a ticket, it will help you raise a ticket. We're very much looking to expand that further to what other tools can we bring in. Like I said, pretty much everyone has an AI at this point, so bringing them all into a central point and seeing how we can integrate them and expand it outside of our end user operations team to pretty much any team that wants to, given time, obviously. But it's a big project we have going on currently to centralize everything, and essentially we'll be using Times as a proxy, I suppose, where API comes in to Times handles the event, and then with Times we can do automation and have that automation go back out to our chatbots.
Very cool. So you're kind of like adding in the AI in the middle of the story in order to add in more context or make decisions based off of whatever the input was.
Exactly, yeah, more context, but we can also use it to, if we're sending from one bot, then that bot has all the context it needs for responding. So if I send out a message to you saying you need to do your training, if I just send you a Slack message with that, you're not going to be able to respond and say what training. Whereas when the bot has the context, it can at least answer and say, oh, I think you're talking about this, and point you in the right direction.
Awesome. Cool. And yeah, I feel like especially if you have multiple AI products, being able to combine that into one space just for ease of use would be huge.
Yeah, 100%. And there's a lot of, like within Times itself, the new AI functions that have been launched as well. We're only scratching the surface with them. We've only got the go ahead to actually enable. So there's a lot of stuff that will be able to come from that as well. You can use the AI tile to actually, like you said, you can summarize data and then spit that back out to a user. So there's a lot of ways we can work about it, and trying to join all the dots of different ones together and figure out the best way. It seems like Tides is kind of going to be our central hub for managing all the incoming AI data and then being able to pass it out to whatever we need, bots or things like that.
Very cool. And I know when we were prepping, you were talking about the automatic mode for the event transform and how that's the team with building too, even though it's only been enabled recently.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, you can do all the Times training. I've done all of it, but the automatic event transform is going to be a game changer. I think it is. You can just tell it give me the emails from here. You don't need to actually explode an event and then implode it again. You can kind of write it out and it will spit out the code and it will do it all for you in one single pill instead of multiple different actions.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite features too that we released this year. I feel like, especially for folks that aren't, very well versed in automation, it'll just help them a ton, not having to do those complicated event transforms.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the great things with Times is it's low code, but you can also go very in depth. I mean, I have some formulas in actions that are like map lambda with lambdas in them, and regex extract and very complex things. Whereas with the AI event transform, you can kind of get the same thing with regular speech, which is quite nice because it brings the barrier down again for people being able to actually deploy and use it.
Cool. I know you had a few other use cases that were kind of top of mind for you for the next, quarter or 2 quarters. We talked a little bit about like help desk and AI. Is there any other, are there any other areas around the help desk that you're planning on automating?
Yeah, so we're looking at, again, pages. Like I mentioned earlier, pages are a fantastic feature. You don't need to build a web app for people. You can just drag a page and it's done for you. You can grant access based on groups, and only people that need to access it can access it. So from that, we're kind of working with our help desk end user operations team to see where we can build to help them, what their pain points are currently. And it, like I mentioned earlier, it allows us to create very complex flows using very high level and very privileged API credentials without everyone needing access to that. So the page will allow you to input, for instance, a Jira ticket and a user. And behind the scenes, it can do a lot of stuff, but as far as the user is concerned, that's all they need to know is that information. So pages are huge for us, and the fact that we can hide the privileged credential and have it just do what we need it to do is extremely good for us, and it's super, like, even prototyping without having to build pages. You can just drag it in, quickly ask for what information you want and build from there, and then when you go live, it's ready to go. You just give the link to whoever needs it.
Very cool. And are you using this like exclusively within the IT team? So other folks on IT are utilizing these pages to get their work done, or are you also doing any kind of self-service pages as well?
So currently it's mostly IT team and security, but we are looking at how we could, again, expand that out and build integrations that don't just touch us, that can do self-service for other things. So can't think of any example top of my head, but multiple other teams are very much interested in how we could create something for them that's very easy for the end user without having the burden of supporting the web app. And there's, if you're running 10 different automations all with their own web apps, you don't need to worry about that at times. You can kind of just create the page and it's within the story, and then you know where it is and what it's doing without having to worry about the back end code.
Awesome. Cool. And then I know you're also doing some specific work with visual verification. So working with a tool that allows you to essentially verify who you are. Can you tell me more about like that particular use case?
Yeah, so that's kind of ties back to the likes of the help desk and self-service kind of things. I'm sure people on the call are aware that OAuth isn't, or WebAuthn even, doesn't play nice with Adobe or Microsoft Office 365 for signing in, which in the past has required someone from our end user operations to get on a call with someone to verify their identity, then give them a bypass code so that they can actually log in and do the license. That alone takes a lot of effort on their point, but also given time zones, if someone puts in a request the end of the day in San Francisco, it could be until Dublin morning before someone's able to respond, and then before they can get on a call, we have to wait for their work hours. We're looking into a few different tools for it. We're trialing one at the minute where essentially a help desk can put in a user and a Jira ticket, and it will generate a visual verification link, put it onto the ticket, email it to the user. They can follow that flow, and then the API for that will return and say this person's verified, to the point that we don't even really need the help desk to give that code anymore. We can send that code directly to the user. We can have it one-time use. We can have it set for 10-minute use. We can do it by Slack. There's many options, but that would allow people to self-service get into the likes of Adobe to sync the license or O365. But there's also way more that we can do with that when we kind of have the right tool and figure out what we want to do. As long as the APIs are there, we could use it for onboarding. We can use it for, adding an additional YubiKey to your account if you've been locked out. So we're still being able to verify that person is who they say they are, without needing someone from the help desk to sit on a 15-minute call with them to verify and then walk them through the process.
Yeah, and I can imagine the efficiency that you gain from being able to do this around the clock is going to be huge. Like as you mentioned, your team is in like multiple different time zones. The company's in multiple different time zones. So you could have folks in like a completely different location just continuing to work even if the IT folks aren't available.
Yeah, 100%. Like someone in Sydney, if it's past SF hours, they'd be able to self-service and work themselves. We can also then log multiple ways of doing it. At the minute in the trial, we're using timed records to kind of log when something happens so that we can have a track of a lot of, this person has gone through, this person's been approved, this person was granted a code, that kind of thing. And there's a lot more we can do around that. But I think that is a pain point in a lot of companies is how do you deal with verifying someone is who they say they are? Because obviously you don't want to just give out a code to allow someone to bypass their WebAuthn, but having something like that in the middle where it will say, yep, we verified this person against their ID and we're confident it's them, it unlocks a whole host of potential capabilities for us and a lot of time savings. The tests we've been doing already, it's probably been, again, 30 minutes per ticket that people have had to work on. And that's just from the help desk side. That's not including the user having to wait for the call, join the call when they're available. So it kind of streamlines it and makes it a better experience for the users in the company, but also takes a lot of the work load off of our end user operations team.
I love hearing that. I also know you mentioned records a little bit, and I'd love to dig into that a little bit more. You mentioned using that as kind of a log of all of the actions that were taken within that particular story. Are you utilizing records in the same way for other stories? How have you monitored the actual actions taken by the autonomous automations that are working in your tenant?
Yeah, so we kind of have been toying around with records to see how we could utilize them. A lot of our endpoint stories, security stories, we're using records to literally just keep a record of what's happened. The good thing about records as well is they're not read-only by default, so you can actually edit them. So in the likes of an interaction with a user, we can send them a link for visual verification. It might take them an hour to complete it, but then we can have a webhook, look up their record, and then know all the details of the ticket that was entered and the user, and then pick that data back up and work with it at a different point in time without having to keep it on a story run ID and without having to keep the information, like without having to put an event pause in, for instance, in times. You can do it on the fly, which we found extremely useful. And it is essentially functioning as a database. So it is great for dealing with that kind of information. That it's not really what the original use case behind records was, but I think it's something that's definitely becoming more popular in times to do because it's such an easy way of dealing with that information.
Very cool. I love records as well, and love that you're using it both with the editable records and then also just as like essentially an audit log of what's going on in your tenant.
Yeah, exactly. Like we can have read-only records if we don't want anything touched, but we can also have edit ones where we need them. So it's nice to have the flexibility.
I know we wanted to talk a little bit about the big red button story a little bit more in depth. I would love to hear about like any lessons that you learned as you were building out that massive story, and then also just general lessons that you've learned throughout your automation journey.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the key thing that goes for any story is the process chain. How does every system interact with each other? It's pretty much how you'd go about building it in any coding situation or any system, but I think it's a key fact that a lot of people tend to overlook, where they can just say, oh, we can get the information from here. Does that information actually reflect what's happening further upstream or further downstream? And making sure you have all the knowledge you need to make informed decisions with your automations. So the likes of big red button stuff, we can query multiple points of systems, including internal. We have a Tines tunnel to internal systems, so we can actually query internal systems as well as our identity systems, as well as our kind of source of truth for everything, and make sure they all line up with each other. And if there's a problem, we can easily flag that. We can do it through Slack, various ways of flagging that. But because of that, you can get an alert pretty instantaneous to go, oh, this is an issue, we should look into this. But 100%, the process chain and how you're building it is kind of key to understanding if it will work the way you expect it to work. So that's always a good point. And like I said, it applies to most things, but it's always a good call out because that is generally where you have to start in any kind of case for automation.
Yeah, so making sure you have all of the manual steps kind of documented out, any tools that you're touching or any information that you need, and getting all of that together again.
Yeah, like if someone is being offboarded manually, what steps are involved? Making sure you're not missing any of the steps. Where is that data coming from? Who do we trust to say this is actually happening? That kind of thing. And writing it out so you can kind of build a quick diagram of the process, and then from the process, bring that across into your automations and start building it from there. And because Tines is so low code and drag and drop, it's very easy to translate a diagram into Tines. You can literally build it almost the same as your diagram if you want. So it's quite a good call out step to always do with any automations.
Any other lessons learned or things that you'd like to call out from either the big button story? I know that was like the big one that you first started with, or any of the other stories that you've built.
Yeah, I mean, like I have here as well, rate limiting. I'm sure everyone on the call is aware of rate limiting. When you're building and coding, it's usually second nature to add in some error checks. Because you can build so quickly in Tines, it is easy to forget that you need to have some way of verifying you're not hitting rate limits. What happens when you hit it? Do you need exponential back off? Do you need to wait a certain amount of time? So always testing your story to make sure you are taking into account rate limits and how you handle them. And also, do you need to spit out them errors somewhere? Like, do you need someone to be told, hey, if you've some system that only has 100 calls a day for some reason, do you need to spit that out to be like, we might need to bump this up? And how do you deal with processing that? Like, is this a critical path that we need to call out when something goes wrong? Or is it okay to leave it sit and wait and then try again after X amount of time, or after trying exponential back off, that kind of thing?
What are your favorite ways for handling those rate limits? I know you mentioned like setting up alerts. Do you do that in a certain way within Tines?
It kind of depends on the story. Like I said, if it's something that isn't a critical path and we can allow it to wait and try again, or we can, Google, for instance, loves exponential back off. So for Google, we know it's pretty fine to do exponential back off. We can deal with the error and say, okay, wait, random time +1, +2, whatever we need to do. Very simple example of how they handle error handling, but gets the point across. But every system deals with it differently. Some systems don't even tell you if hit a limit. They just 404, or they just on-off you, that kind of thing. And in them situations, you have to figure out the best way of dealing with it. Because if you're not getting any response to tell you need to exponentially back off, you're not getting a response to tell you wait X amount of time, you need to figure out how best to deal with that. How is this system working? Can I tell it to wait 5 minutes and try again? Will that be enough time for it? Or is there a hard limit for the day? Do we need to wait 24 hours before we can try again? So each system is different in terms of how you deal with it, but generally speaking, most systems everyone would be familiar with has good documentation around how you handle their rate limits.
Very cool. And you build all of that into the story itself, right? Like either through setting up retries on the HTTP request actions, or adding in maybe action monitoring for any major errors.
Yeah, there's a few different ways. I mean, the simple way is triggers. Is the status returned what we expect? If not, branch out of that trigger and go to another flow, and then dump it back in the top of the funnel and let it process again. If it's still having an error, like Google's a good example with that, exponential back off, still an error, branch and wait longer, that kind of thing. But we can also say after 3 times, for instance, it's not working, fire an alert, let us know that this isn't working and we need to investigate why it's not working. But yeah, you can go as simple as triggers, you can go way up the chain. I mean, one thing with Tines is, like I said, low code, but you can also write Python into Tines if you need to. So like you can go any direction you need to go to be able to deal with it. And generally in stories, it's just something I always look at now is, does the story have rate limits? Like a rate limit and error checking. And if not, we should probably put it in, even if it's not going to be called that often. It's just better to future-proof it now and make sure we are checking and handling everything that can be thrown our way.
Awesome. And then I know another area that you mentioned was really important was just simplifying things. Would love to hear more about that from your perspective as you built out your stories.
Yeah, so I think when you start with Tines, it can get very easy to have a story that has 50 million different actions, because you can have an action and then just drag another action and another action, and it can get very, very long and complicated looking very quickly. With the functions and stuff available in Tines, like Lambda, being able to run a Lambda on an array that's coming in, or being able to do a map Lambda, for instance, you can most of the time compress a lot of steps into one step instead of 10. And thinking at it from that way is usually a good way of making sure the story looks very easy and visually appealing, but also you can visually follow where it's coming from. If I had to give you a story, for instance, you'd be able to see what is happening with descriptive names. You don't necessarily need to know that within the event, it's actually doing a Lambda function here, or it's actually running a Python script to do stuff. It just brings it all and crushes it down into the smallest parts. And I think that's kind of what we strive for a lot now, is how do we make the story look as simple as possible without having too many actions? Is it, does it actually require 10 actions? Can we just compress that into one action and have the action and the formula do everything we need it to do? Event transform is a great example, especially with the AI component now. Like that is going to make simplification a lot easier for dealing with large arrays or nested arrays, that kind of thing.
Awesome. Love that. And love that one of our recent features is helping improve the simplicity of your stories. Yeah, especially with those event transforms.
100%, yeah. And that's kind of, Tides have always been very good at taking feedback and working with it very quickly. So it's made our life of simplifying things a lot easier as well. So it's definitely a two-way road on that we can give feedback and the feedback gets taken on board, things get changed, and it makes our simplifying process a lot easier in the long run.
Awesome. Well, as we're waiting for questions to come in from the chat, I did just want to give you a few minutes to talk through any of the stories that you wanted to highlight beyond what we've talked about so far, or if there's any other pieces of advice that you have for folks on the call that are just starting their automation journey.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think a good example is, like I kind of touched on earlier, using Tines as a proxy for API calls. Because Tines supports webhooks, like you can create a webhook and have something talk into Tines, you can use it as a proxy for APIs. So where you don't want to have the system integrate directly, a lot of systems we've dealt with lately, and again, I'm sure a lot of people on the call, a lot of them want a lot further and higher access than they actually need to do their job. So in them cases, we can have the API call into Tines. Tines will do the API call to the service, take the information and send it where it needs to go. And I think that's a good use case that a lot of people don't even think about using Tines for, but it's a great example of how you can limit access to systems without having to limit functionality of the systems. So it's always good with them. We have stories that do like secret scanning in Slack, for instance, really intense, in-depth stories. And then we have stories that probably run once or twice a month, if even, for like very obscure things that may happen. So we can pivot either way as needed.
Awesome. Well, I have our first question from the audience, and it's a two-part question. So can you share specifics on how you're using Tines for Jamf and any XDR platform?
Yeah, so Jamf specifically, we're integrating with currently the likes of Duo. So when a device is assigned, Warren has built out a story to check that the device is assigned, or if a device has been unassigned, or if a device, it's not assigned. We can check our inventory system, take that in. We can then check Jamf and check, hey, this is assigned to this user. We can look that user up in Okta. We can verify that device is a trusted endpoint within Duo. And then we can basically have it all in the background, automate and connect everything together. There's also a lot of other like endpoint patch management that Warren has been able to build in Jamf, or in Tines for Jamf specifically. And it's like a lot of it is, to be honest, over my head because I'm not endpoint engineering. But he's been able to use the Python features, for instance, to import libraries that he needs to deal with data that doesn't fit a normal flow and spit that data out. But it's, for patch management, for instance, we can check that someone hasn't been done it. One of the things we're going to be working on is like a nudge bot, essentially, that will pester you in Slack if you haven't updated, that kind of thing. So that's kind of where we're looking with the Jamf information is, are you up to date? You're over your 3 days. Query and see, is this person on holiday? Yes, cool, we can wait. No, cool, let's pass it on Slack. If we don't get a response, you can go up the chain, that kind of thing. We are looking at integrating kind of other systems, in Tune, for instance. But like I said, I'm not the best one to talk about them systems because while I know the stories in Tines, I don't know the nitty gritty of what the endpoint engineering plans are. I hope that answered the question. If not, feel free to throw in, I can clarify more.
Yeah, sounded great to me. We have a couple other questions. First one is, our organization has the age-old problem of dealing with technical debt. Is this something that you've encountered at Reddit, and what are your recommendations for attempting to solve it, or at least attempting to solve it?
Yeah, I think that goes across any company. There's always going to be tech debt. I was quite lucky when I joined Reddit that a lot of the stuff that I would like to implement was implemented already, but there's always going to be tech debt. I think the best way to deal with it is look at kind of what is the most critical in the tech stack. Is it stuff dealing with identity? Is it dealing with security flows? Tackling them and looking at it from a high level and saying, what are the steps involved to move that? Like if I wanted to move from one MDM system to another, for instance, if we need to do that, most of the time you can do that in Tines and have an API, pull in the details for the user in the current system, spit it out into the new system. A lot of planning is involved in getting rid of tech debt, and unfortunately that is just the way it works. But the easiest way I've always found to solve it is literally just what is the one that is most critical and generally breaking the most, causing the most headaches. Start with that, reduce it down into its key components, and then you can kind of storyboard it in Tines and be like, one thing I always do if I'm building a bigger one is drag and drop HTTP requests and anything I need to know. I don't need to fill them out, but just put in what it does, and then from there be able to build it out. Another great thing that I don't think I touched on is curl commands. If the API has curl commands, you can literally copy the curl command and paste it into Tines and it will create the request for you, which is insanely time saving. So that is quite a good way to storyboard, and it's a good place to start anyways.
Cool. So it sounds like take the thing that's breaking the most and then plan it out in Tines and go from there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, start from the big fish, which I know a lot of people like to start at the easiest ones to kind of go for, but generally the big fish will have some kind of dependencies that when you start on the smaller ones, you'll realize you actually need to change the bigger one anyways. So you're better kind of ripping the band-aid off first, so to speak, and digging into it.
And the next question I have is, which story are you the most proud of?
There are a lot, to be honest. A lot of stories I've made, a lot of stories security have made, a lot of stories the endpoint engineering team have made. I mean, good examples like the Google groups when we touched on, simple kind of stories, but have had a big impact for the users within Reddit. That has sped up a lot of things. And while it's not a critical path, it does allow for managers and HR, that kind of thing, to very quickly send out emails or calendar invites to the right people without needing to manually do it. And previous to that, that was a complete manual task. We didn't have automated groups for it. You had to literally remember your reports, which is fine for a manager, but if you're, VP level, you're not going to know everyone in your org chain. So that's a good example of that. The security stories we built, we were able to build them pretty quick. We moved off an old platform that didn't give us much flexibility, very much an integration platform rather than an integrator platform, and you couldn't really build anything they hadn't built already. So we were able to do a lot of things while migrating off that opened up a lot more possibilities for us, which tied into our security goals and that kind of thing.
And then if you hadn't optimized your IT automations and implemented these projects, what would the impact on your day-to-day have been? Would you been able to complete or achieve different projects otherwise?
I would probably have a lot more gray hair. But yeah, I think IT automation is, especially as a company is growing, is something. It's always great if you can factor that in an early stage company and have that be part of the growing, but I don't think that's generally how it works in most places. But yeah, I mean, the time saving for me alone, if I didn't have big red button, for instance, we'd have to constantly do everything manually within our identity systems. We wouldn't know that we were tying the right records in Jamf to the right records in Omnitsa. So if the help desk looked at something, it might be different information there than it is in another system. So making sure we can have all the information up to date and tied together is a huge time saver. You look in one place, you can pretty much guarantee that it's going to be correct because the automations are making sure everything is mapping to each other and throwing alerts if that's not the case. We have a story that I looked at earlier before this that was like 50,000 webhook calls in the last 7 days, and it's only had to fire 6 alerts. So things like that, where it takes a big process of reviewing information, automating that away, and just having it spit out when there's a problem, saves a lot of time. I don't think, to be honest, there'd be really any way to achieve what we've been able to achieve with times and automations if we didn't have it. I don't think it'd probably take 20 more people on the team to be able to manually do stuff. So automation is a huge time saver, and I'm very much if it can be automated and it's not going to take longer than what it will be needed for, automate it. It makes so much more sense. Or if it's a process that may be done once a quarter, for instance, that is very time consuming, how long will it take to automate? Why don't we automate it? And even though it's only being used once a quarter, that can add up quite quickly in terms of hours saved and also information being pulled. It takes the human component away. So you're not, I'm not copying the wrong cell into an Excel sheet, for instance.
Yeah, so it sounds like even though you had the initial investment in time of building out the automations, the time savings easily eclipse any time spent actually in the Times platform.
100%. And I mean, like I mentioned, from a small company to a big company, automation can unlock so much potential. If you're in a small little business, you can automate certain things and it will definitely help with your time, but also making sure the data is correct and flowing where it needs to be. And then in big business, obviously, that's a whole different thing that you really need to. There is no ifs or buts. There's no way of scaling without having automation in place.
Next question from the audience is, so this seems great and all, but how did you get the buy-in to purchase another software product on top of your existing stack? I'm often told to use the systems today, which, as you said, aren't great for all of the cross-tool orchestration.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think from every aspect of every company, it's very similar, especially in the IT CorpTech world. For us, it was being able to demonstrate that what we needed wasn't the time involved in building what we needed in other platforms versus the time saved in building it in Tines was kind of our major point of being able to sell Tines to be able to purchase it. Identity management is kind of a key one, and especially in the CorpTech IT kind of world and the endpoint engineering world. I think looking at the identity and how that is handled in a system is kind of a great starting point for evaluating a system. If you're going to have to write some code to be able to deal with an identity JSON blob coming in, is that actually automation, or are you basically just putting your code in a different place? Whereas with Tides, you can just throw it together. You can view the JSON. Like I said, the copy path feature alone is kind of what sold me, is the ease of double clicking on an actual path and having that just copied without me having to remember its body, payload, user name, blah, 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 is a huge time saver. And as I kind of referenced earlier, the fact you can copy curl commands, if anyone on the call is kind of interested in looking at Times, start a free account and just copy a curl command and you will see what I mean. It's just so quick and easy to do it. You do need to do some tweaks, like the credentials, for instance. Obviously, you'll need to change them, but it's just the fact I can do that rather than have to think about structuring the API request is a huge time saver as well.
Cool. So it sounds like when talking about automation, you're mostly focused on how much time can be saved on your team in general. And then, I guess any other time savings that come out of the actual automations themselves is huge as well.
Yeah, I think there's kind of three main points of any automation when you're looking at it is time saved for your team, time saved for the company, but then also the security aspects of being able to secure a credential and how you can store a secure credential. I can put a credential in Times. I don't need to worry about someone going in and copying it. You don't see the value anymore. It's stored in a key store. And also the privacy aspect of it. Like you can do anonymized feedback on pages if you wanted. So there's a lot of different options out there within Times that you can use. And they kind of, when you think in that way, you can kind of start unlocking automations that you didn't even think you'd need that will actually impact some other team and make their life easier.
Awesome. And then another question is, how much do you do natively in Tines? So with the Tines actions versus Tines running Python or the automatic mode for the event transform, for example?
I would say 99% is native. Like Tines has a great template library, and if there's no template, it's very easy to build it. I'd say the cases where we use the kind of scripting is more so in cases of the API from the service isn't great and you need to do some work on it to actually get it working, or on bigger things like you can trying to think of like the security examples we have where it would take way too big a formula to actually build. And while the formulas are great and you can, like I said, build lambdas and map lambdas and that kind of thing within a formula, if you have to start nesting map lambdas and map lambdas and map lambdas to get what you want, that's kind of where we look at, okay, maybe it's just easier for us to use the Python script and tell it to do what we want, to prettify the JSON essentially. Mm-hmm. But 99, top of my head, I'd put money on 99% of what we do is natively in Tides.
Well, so to kind of like recap, it sounds like if there's a funky API that just doesn't play nicely with HTTP requests, or if you do something like super complicated with your event transforms.
Yeah, pretty much. If it's like a very nested array kind of situation, that's when the Python scripting kind of comes into clutch very quickly. And the fact you can actually do that, a lot of other platforms don't allow you to actually get into the depths, but when you need to, it's there, which is always nice. It just means you keep one platform. You don't need to then go, okay, now I need to rip all of this out and build it in Python and deploy it somewhere. I can just put the Python I need into Times.
Awesome. Well, I think we are done with questions. So thank you so much for joining us, Cian, and thank you for everybody in the audience for tuning in. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and yeah, thanks for joining.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the questions.